Okay, so we had discussed how the means of production is a central issue in this debate between capitalism versus socialism. And to be specific, it's regarding the ownership of the means of production, whether it should be owned by private individuals or by the state. Now, capitalism, as we acknowledged previously, argues that it should be private individuals. Why? It's because that private individual, that entrepreneur, is motivated by attaining profit. And ultimately, this leads to the market forces under operation in that system, supply and demand, what have you, determining prices, shaping distribution, and ultimately leading to economic vibrancy in that system, right? Okay, and therefore, it's at bottom, at the, if you will, the atomic level of capitalism, it's the private individual, right? That is central. Now, opposed to that is socialism, and of course, they reject the notion of private ownership. Rather, they argue that the state should control the means of production. So this brings up the question, why? Why would socialism argue this? Well, in very basic terms, here's how those adherents to socialism criticize capitalism based on private ownership. They argue that, this capitalist system based on private ownership basically sets up this socio-economic hierarchy, the social hierarchy. You could call it the haves versus the have-nots. You could call it the corporate elite versus, the everyday worker, right? The working class. You could call it Wall Street versus Main Street, however you want to frame it. But in that hierarchy, there's exploitation that's basically visited upon those in the lower ranks of that system. Okay, so they view the source of exploitation on social class conflict that's inherent to capitalism, right? So socialism, the goal with socialism through public ownership by the state is partly to eliminate those class divisions. And they do this by, distributing resources according to need rather than profit. Okay, so again, in a very basic sense, and even a fundamental sense, this is how you see the differences between capitalism and socialism. Certainly, this was central in the debate between the socialism that you see emerge in the Soviet Union. And by the way, the name for that sort of socialism was called Marxist-Leninism. Okay, and that's opposed, of course, to liberal democracy wedded to capitalism, right? And by the way, I just used the term liberal democracy, right? And how it's joined at the hip with capitalism. You see liberal democracy, which is not economic, it's political, right? But during the Cold War era especially, and this is an article of faith among Americans back then, was that these two beliefs and practices, that is to say, the political belief in liberal democracy and the economic view based on capitalism, that these two were, again, wedded to each other, and you can't really separate them. Okay, now at the risk of confusing you even more, perhaps, well, back then in the Cold War era, and somewhat today still, Marxism and socialism and communism were thought to be synonymous. At least they were bandied around in public discourse as being nearly synonymous, when in fact there are very sharp conceptual distinctions between the three. Okay, but just to distinguish between communism and socialism, communism argues that the state, as well as private property and even social classes, will wither away after the establishment of a socialist political economy, which had already replaced a capitalist economy. Okay, so there's this historical narrative here. There's capitalism, and then it gets overthrown by socialism, and after socialism comes communism, right? Where again, the state, private property, and social classes wither away. And in this communist state is sort of utopian, right? It's very utopian, actually. Okay, this perfect society, if you will. Now that we have a conceptual understanding here of the difference between socialism and capitalism, well, let's go back to the end of World War II and the onset of the Cold War, back to the mid-1940s. And let's discuss how the differences between these competing political economies actually led to the Cold War. Now, speaking of Cold War, quote unquote, what is the distinction between a Cold War and a hot war? Well, that should be readily apparent to you, hopefully. A hot war is a conflict that is marked by military hostility, right? War, basically, right? That's a hot war. But you could also have a conflict that is marked by the absence of actual military conflict between the two sides, okay? And because there's the absence of military conflict, there's the absence of actual wars, and body counts and what have you. Well, this is a Cold War, okay, and that's why they called it the Cold War, because you never see an actual battle, let alone a entire war, fought between the United States and the USSR. But it was a very heated competition, and as we'll discuss very soon, there was a hot war that took place during the Cold War, and that hot war took place in the third world countries, okay? And again, this is going to be a discussion that we will undertake soon. But first, again, let's go back to the end of World War II. Now, the end of World War II marked the end of the so-called Age of European Imperialism, right? And something we discussed because of the theme of this course, imperialism and overseas colonialism. Well, as I mentioned, as I'm sure I mentioned a while back, the high point of this age of European imperialism, whereby all these European empires went outside their borders and occupied, if not controlled and dominated areas throughout the world. Well, the high point of that was indeed by the turn of the 20th century, where over 90% of the globe was colonized, if not just dominated, by some European empire. Okay, now that all crashes down. This system that has its beginnings since 1492 and then continues through the ensuing centuries crashes down with the end of World War I and World War II. If you know anything about these wars, you see the collapse of all these empires like the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austria-Hungary Empire, so on and so forth. And then certainly the German Empire, right, by World War II. The English Empire would collapse in the 1950s. The French Empire would collapse. And what would replace this imperial system would be nation states, okay, rather than empires. Okay, so this is the scenario that we have globally with the end of World War II, the beginning of the Cold War, right? Now, with the destruction of Europe and Japan, the United States assumed the mantle of the most powerful nation in the world at that time by the end of World War II. We were the most powerful nation. We were unscathed by World War II because no wars were fought on U.S. soil, right? Sure, we suffered greatly in terms of casualties. Almost 500,000 soldiers perished on the battlefield. But, that pales in comparison to the various European empires that fought, especially the Soviet Union, which lost over 20 million people. So we were the most powerful nation in the world. That doesn't surprise us at this time, right? With the rest of the world left in the ashes of destruction. So the leaders in the United States saw this as an opportune moment for the United States to restructure the global order. Okay, so as mentioned here, the question is, okay, how are we going to refashion the world whereby it could be aligned to the particular vital interest of the country, right? So here are two concerns, or even two goals, that the American post-war planners had in mind as they undertook this project of refashioning the world after World War II. The two concerns were to prevent another world war, and number two, to prevent another global depression, right? The Great Depression, right? So, number one, prevent another world war. Well, as we discussed, World War I was the war to end all wars. And then what happens right after that? World War II. So in 1945, no one knew if, World War III would happen again. I mean, it seemed like a possibility because everyone thought World War II wouldn't happen. So who's to say another world war would erupt right after? So this concern to prevent another world war was foremost on the minds of these American post-war global planners. The second one exposes the link between the Great Depression and the onset of World War II. And we discussed how the Great Depression, right, served as this economic condition that gave rise to the conditions of possibility for fascism to spread as an ideology, hence leading to more imperial conflict. Well, needless to say, the post-war planners were aware of this connection between ideology and economics, and therefore they were thinking about how to prevent another Great Depression. How do you restructure the world that would prevent the advent of still another Great Depression? You have to remember that this was the greatest economic calamity that ever afflicted the world, let alone the United States. And who's to say another Great Depression could happen again? So these two concerns, again, occupied the minds of global planners. And here's their solution, as stated on the bottom of the slide. The solution was to promote international free trade. And because, as I discussed, it was felt that international free trade was joined at the hip with democracy, well, let's spread liberal democracy as well. Okay. So in the next slide, we'll discuss why these two are linked to the restructuring of the world and how they went about implementing this vision.